I'm Slava Silva. Welcome to Conversations with Slava. Today, I'm talking to Andrew Feinstein, former MP for the African National Congress, author of the books After the Party, A Personal and Political Journey Inside the ANC, and Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade, co-founder of Shadow World Investigations. You have spoken about the so-called labor anti-Semitism crisis. Could you please address the treatment of anti-Zionists and socialists in the Labour Party?
Thanks, Slava. It's very good to be with you. This is an issue that is of great concern to me. I obviously, as a white person growing up in apartheid South Africa, I was on the privileged side of a very racist divide. And I decided in my teens to join the African National Congress, the liberation movement trying to overthrow apartheid in South Africa, the party of Nelson Mandela. And racism has always been a very important issue to me. That was only more the case because my mother, who was from Vienna in Austria, was herself a Holocaust survivor. She survived the war in Vienna itself, spending 3.5 years hidden in a coal cellar. She lost 39 members of her family in the Holocaust, mainly in Auschwitz and Theresienstadt. And I have always been very focused as a consequence of issues of anti-racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and have actually written about genocide prevention and lectured on genocide prevention at Auschwitz itself on behalf of the Auschwitz Institute. And I became very concerned when I saw within the British Labour Party, which is quite divided between a sort of a more conservative wing and a more left-wing wing, if you will, a more progressive wing, that the issue of anti-Semitism started to be used against the former leader of the party, Jeremy Corbyn, who himself is a lifelong anti-racist. He was a big supporter of the struggle against apartheid. He is a big supporter of the Palestinian people and is very critical of Israel, as am I. And when people started to accuse other people within the Labour Party of being anti-Semitic in most instances, not in every instance, but in most instances on very spurious grounds, I became very concerned by this and started weighing in, because I think that when anti-Semitism is used where it might not exist, like Jeremy Corbyn is by no means an anti-Semite. There is no evidence whatsoever of him being an anti-Semite. And to accuse someone like that of anti-Semitism, to effectively try and replace them as party leader, I think actually undermines the fight against the very real struggle against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, and all racism. And what has concerned me even more is how progressive, anti-racist Jews who support Jeremy Corbyn have been treated within the Labour Party. It's as though these sorts of Jews don't exist, that all Jews are of one opinion and one mind, which is an absurdity because it's a very diverse and broad community. And in fact, there has been a vilification of left-wing Jews in the Labour Party who support Jeremy Corbyn. So in my own case, to give you an example, I was posting online on social media in support of Corbyn, and I was very heavily criticized for this online. So I then started posting a bit more about my background and my family's background to try and explain why I have the views I have. And when I did that, I received messages, for instance, from two rabbis, one in the United Kingdom, one in the United States, saying, oh, your mother must have been a capo, a Nazi collaborator, which is really the worst thing that you can say to a Jew, let alone to a Holocaust survivor. And that has been the sort of nature and the tenor of the way in which progressive Jews have been attacked and vilified within the Labour Party. In addition to which, the new leadership of the Labour Party, which is a more conservative leadership than Jeremy Corbyn's, have stopped branches of the Labour Party from discussing the issue at all, from discussing the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn. They've really closed down democracy. They've closed down what is effectively, or should be effectively, a space for discussing all political issues, including Israel's very brutal and illegal occupation of Palestine. So it's been a very, very strange experience for me as a progressive Jew being in the Labour Party at this time.
How do you assess the direction the party is currently taken under Keir Starmer? Do you see possible change at some point?
I see a huge change in the leadership from Jeremy Corbyn to Keir Starmer. Corbyn was almost an anomaly in British politics generally, in that he is what we would describe as an internationalist. He believes, for instance, that Britain should not be involving itself in conflicts around the world, in the Middle East and elsewhere. He believes that Britain shouldn't be selling weapons, which is my area of expertise, shouldn't be selling weapons to undemocratic authoritarian regimes, particularly regimes like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Israel, but also his leadership of the Labour Party was about giving power to the members of the party. And the membership of the party grew hugely under his leadership by hundreds of thousands of members, so that it became the largest membership party in Europe. Under Keir Starmer, he really is not interested in the membership and has been drawing back, I believe, on democracy and freedom of speech within the party, and has been trying to turn the party into a much more mainstream party, very supportive, for instance, of Britain's involvement in various conflicts around the world, in the so-called war on terror, very in favor of British arms sales to whomsoever, which is extraordinary given that Keir Starmer trained as a human rights lawyer. But even on domestic issues, Labour Party members of Parliament have been told to abstain, in other words, not to vote against some very reactionary legislation in the British Parliament, legislation around the secrecy of illegal actions by the intelligence services, by police services, and by the military in what is called the Spy Cops Bill, where he extraordinarily suggested that Labour should abstain on various issues relating to the welfare state, and even on the Brexit issue, where Keir Starmer was probably the loudest champion of staying within the EU. Now he wants to force Labour members of Parliament to vote for Boris Johnson's very bad Brexit deal. So we're seeing him doing 180-degree turns for what he claimed he would do when he was campaigning for the leadership. And it's a very different leadership to Jeremy Corbyn's. And I think as a consequence, I think Keir Starmer, as leader of the Labour Party, is already, in only a period of a few months, is under very, very intense pressure, because the Labour Party is not doing very well in the opinion polls. And Keir Starmer's own popularity has dropped by 50% in the time since he's been leader.
One of the topics you address in your research on the weapons sales is how they undermine democracy. Have you seen that happen recently in the UK, including attempts to get rid of Labour under Corbyn?
Absolutely. I think how I describe the global arms trade is a trade that is, first of all, the world's most corrupt trade. It accounts for around 40% of all corruption in all global trade. Secondly, it takes place behind a veil of national security imposed secrecy. So politicians, corporate executives, military leaders, intelligence leaders do things on arms deals that they wouldn't do in any other sector because they just wouldn't get away with it. And also, there is almost legal impunity. There are no legal consequences for doing illegal things in the global arms trade. And one of the primary reasons for that is because the bribes paid on arms deals, both in the country that you're selling to, but some of the bribe also comes back to the country that is actually selling the weapons, not buying them. A lot of those bribes go into political parties and to individual politicians. And as a consequence of which, defense budgets remain artificially very, very high. Huge amounts of money are spent on weapons, on the military, when often that doesn't make us any safer or any more secure. And that's because the global arms trade is circulating this money amongst what I call the global national security elite. As a consequence of which, democracies are put under pressure to ensure that nothing disrupts the global arms trade and the way that it functions. And that means also that nothing disrupts the militarism that informs it, the view that we should always resolve differences by armed conflict, the view that Western nations like the United States, the United Kingdom, and others should get involved in disputes in countries like Syria, Yemen, Iraq, etc., etc. So we have seen democracy undermined in order to keep military and arms trade activity secret. We've seen parliaments undermined. We've seen reports of things like the National Audit Office not be made public because they could be embarrassing to senior British politicians because of the bribery and corruption, and because they could be embarrassing to allies like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. But now we're seeing a situation where the entire political establishment in the United Kingdom, which includes the right wing of the Labour Party, have basically used often untrue information to get rid of a very senior politician who, as leader of the second biggest party in the country, was actually a threat to this military industrial establishment. So I think we're seeing in a very direct way how the militarism that informs the arms trade, and the arms trade itself, because of its economics and its intersections with party politics, has systemically undermined democracy. So in other words, we can have democracy so long as democracy produces the sort of politics that we, the establishment, are happy with. And if politics looks as though it's going to undermine what we regard as acceptable, then we don't accept democracy. And that's what we've seen in the United Kingdom.
To what extent is foreign policy, for example, the US government's decision to pursue regime change in Iran or conduct the drone assassination campaign, launch airstrikes against Syria after the Duma incident, or Russia invading eastern Ukraine or Syria, to what extent is this driven by the interests of the weapons makers, or to what extent are those interests just another component, one of many?
I think they are one of many components. I think, the reality is that geopolitics, which are themselves often very problematic, but geopolitics often informs a lot of these decisions. But there is absolutely no doubt that the interests of the weapons makers, which are often the interests of ruling elites, because let's remember, a lot of these weapons making companies, especially in Europe, are either state-owned or partly state-owned. And even when they are in private hands, like in the United States and the United Kingdom, the state still has a very important role in those companies, deciding who it can and can't sell weapons to, and deciding on certain conditionalities of their functioning. So their role, these companies' role in foreign policy, for instance, in addition to which, to keep those economics, the economics of patronage, if you will, to keep those economics going, I think that one needs conflict or one needs threats. So at a particular point in time, in the film of my last book, The Shadow World, in the documentary feature that was made based on the book, we have an arms dealer himself talking about how the war on terror hasn't made anybody safer, but it's made a lot of people in the weapons companies, in politics, political parties, it's made them a lot richer. And if one looks, for instance, at the current conflict in Yemen, where that conflict is being undertaken despite the fact that UN expert panels have reported evidence of violations of international law, war crimes, the United Kingdom, the United States, and many European countries continues to provide weapons to the Saudis and the UAE in huge amounts so that they can continue that conflict. So you have this ridiculous situation in Yemen today where the United Kingdom, for instance, has sold, since the conflict started in March of 2015, has sold around over £8.5 billion of weapons to Saudi Arabia alone, most of which are for use in that conflict. But at the same time, Britain has given a few £1 million in aid to Yemen to deal with the consequences of the very weapons that they've sold to Saudi Arabia, which are being used illegally to bomb schools, places of worship, places of residence, hospitals, etc. So there is a way in which the circle of militarism, of which the arms trade is an essential part, that circle of militarism does in and of itself sometimes initiate conflict and sometimes ensure that conflict continues for a very long period of time in very brutal ways.
By exposing those arms companies, you are also exposing the states, giving them patronage. Have you and your organization faced repercussions from states, border interrogation, searches, surveillance, detention?
So, I think the first and most important thing to say on this very important question is that the people who are most vulnerable are not people like us. We are almost, if you will, the storytellers. So we get information from sources, from whistleblowers. And often those sources or whistleblowers will be within military establishments, within the defense companies, sometimes within governments, within prosecutors' offices. It is those people who give people like us the information who are really putting themselves at risk. And I think we have to pay tribute to them because they are so important in exposing the realities of what is going on in our world. So the sorts of pressure that we face as the storytellers is a very different sort of pressure. It's not, I don't believe, particularly life-threatening, even though on occasions we've received death threats from individual arms dealers sometimes. The way in which we most obviously feel pressure from the state and economic interests, because I think the two are very closely intertwined. I think our politics are a combination of money and power that have become completely intertwined. So to differentiate the state from, for instance, private capital is quite a difficult thing to do in some ways, because private capital in many ways funds aspects of the state. And many people in the state are there as representatives of private capital more than anything else. And the way in which we feel most pressure from them is obviously there is a lot of evidence to show that our communications are surveilled, sometimes intercepted. So we have to be very careful in communicating with sources, with whistleblowers, to do so in safe and encrypted ways. We face a lot of legal pressures. So we face the pressure of, especially in the United Kingdom, which has terrible libel laws, where it's very easy for someone to sue you, and it costs you a fortune of money to defend yourself against such suits. We face a lot of those sorts of pressure, but I think, me personally, more than even my colleagues, I've been doing this work now for 20 years, and I think I've got used to those pressures. And I think we do the work in such a way. So for instance, in my book, The Shadow World, there are almost 3,000 references. So whenever we make any sort of claim, or if I do so speaking publicly like this, it will be because we have either documentary evidence or because we have human source evidence of a number of human sources that we can verify. We won't say anything publicly that we can't verify. But those are the ways in which both political and economic power attempt to exert pressure on us. And we had an instance where there was a completely scurrilous case brought against us, which we suspect the actual person behind it was an oligarch who was himself an arms dealer. And the whole intention of it was just to destroy us financially. It was a completely ridiculous case, but the intention was to try and stop us doing the work that we do. But let me end this by saying none of these pressures are anything by comparison to the sorts of pressures faced by sources and whistleblowers.
Before I ask you about the illegal arms trade, could you please comment on the upcoming Biden administration? General Lloyd Austin III has a connection to arms trade. So has Antony Blinken.
Absolutely. So, I think most people in the world, even if we are not particularly enamored of either the Republican or the Democratic Party, unless perhaps the Democratic Party was led by Bernie Sanders, which unfortunately didn't come to pass, in ways not dissimilar to the way in which Jeremy Corbyn was marginalized in the Labour Party ultimately. So while I think all of us feel some relief at the fact that Donald Trump will be leaving office, even if he needs to be physically dragged out of the White House on the 20th of January, and relief that somebody who at least has some basic understanding of the American Constitution and of the notion of checks and balances, I fear that the Biden administration will at many levels, and certainly in relation to national security, the arms trade, the war on terror, drone strikes, etc., will be very similar to all of the predecessors. So, the reality is that Barack Obama actually personally used to participate for a period of time in what were called Tuesday kill list meetings, when the senior national security operatives in the American administration would sit and decide who was going to be killed in a drone strike the following week. And it sometimes included American citizens. And of course, these drone strikes were without any recourse to the law, be it domestic American law, international law, anything similar. So we shouldn't, because we've had 4 awful years of Trump, we shouldn't forget that what came before Trump was in some respects as bad. And I think in those respects, we're going to see something similar in the Biden administration, in that, as you suggest, his nominee for defense secretary is going to come straight from the board of directors of Raytheon, one of the biggest defense companies on the planet, and in fact, the company that is making most of the missiles that are being dropped on innocent Yemeni civilians today. So it's not just that he comes from a defense company, it's a defense company with a particular history, not just of corruption, but with violating international law, as is being done in Yemen today. So I think we are going to see an administration that on national security and defense issues is going to be no better than what has come before it. As a candidate, Joe Biden said, for instance, that he would withdraw support from Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. If he did something like that, it would show a significant departure from the last many administrations. But I think it's actually incredibly unlikely that he's going to follow through on that campaign promise.
In your film, you spoke to Mr. Joe de Hovsepian, an arms dealer, and there is a reference to his USAID ID. So when researching weapons sales, how do you know that something is fishy, that this is a bribe, that this is supposed to disguise something else? USAID is not supposed to deal weapons. It's supposed to be a US Agency for International Development, right?
So the reality is that all of the arms dealers I've met everywhere in the world tend to be intelligence assets for a number of intelligence agencies around the world, sometimes competing intelligence agencies, ironically. And this is nothing new. So, and this is where the distinction between the legal and the illegal arms trade becomes a bit difficult. Because someone like de Hovsepian has been involved in what might be described as illegal arms deals, but he's also been involved in many what are described as legal arms deals. But the reality is that those legal arms deals have elements of illegality within them. So corruption and bribery, which is often practiced in formal government-to-government arms deals, which are the sort of the legal side of the trade, those often have elements of illegality like corruption and bribery in them. And all the arms dealers I've met have made clear to me that the bribes, the corruption is built into the structure and into the economics of all of these deals. So, you know, if two countries are buying the identical jet fighter, they'll buy it for two completely different prices. And that's partly due to what components they want in that weapon system, but it's also partly due to the size of bribe that has been decided on. So if there's a 5% bribe, the price will be lower. If there's a 30% bribe, the price will be much higher. And the people who are actually paying for those bribes are the taxpayers in both the buying, but also in the selling country. So that boundary between legal and illegal is something of a vague one, and it's why I refer to the arms trade as a whole as the shadow world, because I believe that in every single arms deals, there are elements of illegality. And often the illegal element will be that somebody who is a middleman or an intermediary, an arms dealer in a particular transaction, will actually be involved in all sorts of illegal conduct. So the other example that people might be able to relate to, someone better known than Mr. de Hovsepian, is the Russian arms dealer who's now in jail in America, Victor Bout or Victor Bout. So Victor Bout, the story goes, and I write about this, was flying equipment and arms into Baghdad for the American Department of Defense. And the person who was in charge of the Baghdad airfield at that point knew that he was on, and he had an Interpol red notice issued by Belgium. So Belgium wanted him arrested, and all members of Interpol had a responsibility to arrest him. So when the head of the airfield pointed this out to his superiors in the Department of Defense, they said, okay, but just hold off on telling anyone for 3 months, because we need his transport and logistics services to fly all of the equipment and weaponry that we need in before he's exposed and maybe arrested. So often these arms dealers, who our governments will tell us are only involved in the illegal trade, are doing most of their work for the very governments who are complaining about the illegal trade that they're involved in. So that sounds a bit complicated, but that is the nature of the trade. So when someone like Joe de Hovsepian produced for me, he had 2 sets of ID. So one was ID to show that he was doing work for the American Department of Defense in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then he had a letter showing that he was doing security work for USAID in Africa and other parts of the world. So this is one of the people who's been involved in the trade for over 50 years, who is a very well-known arms dealer, has been involved in both licit and illicit deals. But he does his work very freely because the very states who should be taking action against him are a part of the deals that he's involved in.
Then those bribes are paid. And when the states decide to look the other way, is trade with real estate, is trade with drugs, is human trafficking involved? Have you in your research encountered those types of criminal enterprises?
Absolutely. So a number of arms dealers in the Balkans, a number of governments in the Balkans, and even some arms dealers who are not from the Balkans, but who do a lot of business in the Balkans, for instance, and in parts of Central and Eastern Europe, are involved in many of these trades. So there is an arms dealer who we have tried to track for many, many years, who used to be based in Switzerland and used to do most of his arms dealing through one quite well-known company in Switzerland. He then moved, and I can't remember the exact country off the top of my head, but he moved to the Balkans. He became very friendly with the prime minister of the country, or maybe they became friends before he moved. And as we started researching him more and more in this country now, it was not just arms deals. It was cigarette smuggling. It was drug running. It was certainly human trafficking, trafficking in human organs. So I think that the people involved in the trade in weapons are often not the most ethical people that one will come across. And the sort of ways in which they conduct arms deals are very conducive to conducting other types of organized criminal activity. And for that reason, you often find there is an overlap between these different types of trades. That is particularly the case when it comes to small and light weapons. Handguns, rifles, machine guns, submachine guns, etc. Because these are obviously quite cheap items, they're very easy to transport, and they're also often very central to organized criminal networks. And because those organized criminal networks could be involved in anything from all of those forms of trafficking that we've been speaking about, guns become just another part of the criminal enterprise. In addition to which, we've also investigated circumstances in which weaponry is used as payment on other illegal contracts. So for instance, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there was a situation when a particular arms dealer, in fact, one of the arms dealers who once threatened me personally, he, in order to get mineral or mining concessions, he would offer weaponry to various militia and to the government in the Democratic Republic of Congo in exchange for mineral concessions. We found out that he was also trading in a whole range of other illegal merchandise that the DRC is quite well known for. And so I think weapons is really part of most substantial and quite broad criminal enterprises.
Could you talk about the coverage your work has received in the media and about the efforts by the arms dealers and by the arms companies to influence public opinion and the media coverage, maybe even the weapons money going to the corporations covering them?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that the overlap between large corporations, including some weapons makers, and the media are very close. So the GM Corporation in the United States of America, for instance, also has huge media holdings of some of the big networks. And I think it's one of the biggest problems of our democracies all over the world, where we are lucky enough to live in democracies, that the media is controlled by the very economic and political interests who control our societies and our states. And it's why the media, in my opinion, has become anodyne or very unlikely to criticize the systemic nature of something like the global arms trade or our political and economic realities. But efforts to try and get a better picture of the weapons business into the public domain have been for as long as I can remember doing this work. So I've been offered bribes by defense companies. Basically, they say to me, we will hire you to improve our image in a country where they know I'm investigating. And they will offer me amounts of money that would keep my organization running for many years, because it's very difficult to raise money for this sort of work. So there's that way, which is just bribery. Then, of course, we get those who attempt to present the other side of the story, so that what these companies do is very responsible and very good, and if they weren't doing it, it would be someone else worse doing it. And the way in which that happens sometimes, so I'll give you one example. In the United States, a particular online defense periodical published one of the few very negative reviews of the book. Turns out the author of this review had been a board member at Lockheed Martin, the biggest weapons maker on the planet, and that this particular online publication is funded exclusively by the big weapons makers in the United States. And so once I knew this information, the most extraordinary thing is this information was given to me by people within Lockheed Martin who said, oh, we read this review and we want you to know that this person was on our board and was actually involved in the following very corrupt deals. So then I could respond to the review by suggesting that it might have something to do with this person's connections to Lockheed Martin and to certain specific transactions. The other way that governments and the media attempt to deal with the sort of subject matters we're talking about is by ignoring it. So it's incredibly difficult to get wide publicity. And I have to say that in this respect, the United States was far better than, for instance, the United Kingdom. So the documentary film that was made of the Shadow World was shown on public television in America, but has never been shown by any broadcaster in the United Kingdom. And I think the United Kingdom, because the media universe is smaller, is somewhat easier to control, but also there is bizarrely, there is even more of a closing down of real space for debate in the United Kingdom than I believe there is even in the United States of America.
Thank you very much for this interview, Mr. Feinstein. I wish you all best for your work.
Thank you so much, and thank you for showing the interest to spend the time with me and to interview me about this subject. Thanks very much.